Hello and welcome back to the Gotti Video Podcast. This is a space where we host conversations with different designers, architects, and industry thought leaders to help educate you in your work. My name is Joe Gotti, and I'm the COO and Director of Design here at Gotti Furniture. For today's episode of the podcast, we're welcoming my friends Peter Bolek, President and Director of Design at HBM Architects, and Stephanie Shook, Associate and Interior Designer at HBM Architects. The passion for the whole team at HBM lies in the belief that in addition to solving complex needs for their clients, design has the transformative power to enhance our everyday life experiences. Today, we're going to be exploring how to restore and preserve existing library spaces. Peter and Stephanie, welcome to the podcast today. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Great to be here.
Hi, Joe. Good to be here.
Yeah. So usually we start off, I just want to get a little background and how you guys kind of got here today.
You want to start?
I'll start. I have a little bit more of a journey than Peter's. I actually started out in architecture. My degrees are in architecture. And through my career, I realized I had more passion for interiors and drove into that and really, excelled once I came here, got into the library work and really working through projects that way.
And Stephanie heads our interiors department today, and a team of about 6 interior designers. And so we're happy to have that kind of foresight that she has from both the architectural side and the interior side leading that department.
Yeah, absolutely. So what drew you to interiors over architecture, Stephanie?
It actually was millwork.
Oh, wow.
I was actually working on a stadium project and got into some of the interiors for a boardroom inside the stadium. And I thought, working with millwork and getting into the details and getting into the paint colors, it was really exciting. And just started going from there, grabbing more projects that I could do more of that in. And
very cool.
When I came here, libraries have lots of interiors and so many different pieces that, it's just wonderful projects to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. So Peter, what got you into architecture?
Well, I guess I've always been interested in kind of creating things, and architecture was kind of a familiar thing for me from my family growing up. I have uncles and cousins who are in either a building trade or architecture. My dad was an engineer. And so I went into architecture, and what got me into libraries though was not that my mom was a librarian, but I came to work for David Holsheimer, who at the time was a very small practice, was the founding partner of our firm, and really enjoyed the idea of working on public projects, specifically libraries. And as that grew, I think growing up with my mom being a librarian, it just kind of was a really good fit. It felt good. It was something that I was familiar with, and that's where I started and where we are now.
Interesting. And obviously in preparing for this, it was fun to kind of see how passionate both of you are kind of about architecture, interiors, design, kind of what we're going to be talking about today, preserving. I think it's interesting to say that you hear that your mom is a librarian, because I always tell people that aren't familiar with the library industry, I'm like, you will never meet a more passionate group of people about what they do.
Right.
It is unbelievable when you talk to librarians, like how passionate they are about being librarians, working with the community, serving the community, supporting. It's just very invigorating kind of group of people to work with.
Right. You're absolutely right. I mean, I remember my mom from as a kid going to the library after school, how she knew everyone in the community, and she knew what everybody's interests were, what they were looking for, or just to say hello to them as they came in, and having known them or know them. It really was a great sense of understanding that the library was this central point in the community that everybody had as a destination. So,
yeah, interesting. Well, I want to kind of get into the meat of our discussion here. And like I said earlier, we talked about your guys' passion for kind of preserving architecture. So, in the past, in the over 500 projects here, we're going to get into talk about like kind of what to do, but just to like start off, like it'd be great to hear examples about maybe what's not honored, kind of the integrity of existing buildings.
Sure. You know, what we thought about when we were thinking about a topic for today, what resonated was, the integrity of a library or integrity of a building. And a lot of it comes down to a good kind of example would be Carnegie libraries, how they've changed over the years. And, Carnegie libraries, all of them were very specially designed for each community. They were iconic. They had a quality about them. We've worked with over 35 Carnegie libraries, and most all of them have had some sort of feature added to it that really destroyed the original character or quality of that building. And so thinking about how you should think about that in terms of any renovation or addition, whether you can bring that quality back or kind of preserve the integrity from the original building or enhance it in some fashion, is really part of what we were thinking. The other part is that even when you're designing a brand new building, I think it's important to really understand what community's interests are, so that you're designing a building that's appropriate to that community, that brings an integrity to that community, that brings kind of an inspiring type of presence about the built form that can be experienced by everyone.
Mm-hmm. How do you guys go about, you talk about community interest, how do you guys go about working with the community, kind of determining that? What's your process there?
Well, I think, all of our work starts with engagement, whether it's beginning with just the library, maybe the staff, maybe the board, but it quickly broadens to the larger community and the people who have a vested interest in what happens with the library. And, I think you want to kind of go through some of our experiences with engagement.
We approach it. Each one's unique. Every community is unique. So we work with the library to figure out the best way that we can reach out, engage, and get the best feedback from that community, whether it's a community engagement or separate sessions, possibly with teens, with children separately. We've also done it with some translators. We have a lot of, like some inner city areas that have a lot of Hispanic speaking, or that we've worked with them with photos and imagery. So we try to tailor it to how we can best reach those communities and talk to them and get their feedback on what either they may not even know what a library could provide. So we give them some prompts and ideas of what other libraries are doing and see if anything resonates that way, or we just talk to them and see what they wish they had or how they feel about their library, and have a conversation to bring out those interests.
Yeah, a lot of times we're educating the community about what can be, what's possible, what, they might not know. And it's about sharing thoughts and ideas of what is happening all over the country and getting people to react to that. And, I think a lot of people are talking about today a very important topic of diversity, inclusion, and equity in libraries. And we really feel strongly that inclusionary process has to start with the engagement of the community. We don't think you can really appropriately design a building to meet the needs of the vast majority of a community without diving in, understanding, and getting their input. And as Stephanie mentioned, a lot of times we're in communities where there's a very large shift of demographic cultures. And so, there's sometimes a need for interpreters or other ways that we can engage with people. Some people, like older populations, might not be as comfortable with technology. So how do we, reach them? Maybe we go to a coffee house and we sit down where we know some retired people are getting together for coffee with friends every Wednesday morning or something of that nature. And, we really make sure we try to reach everybody in those input sessions.
Okay, interesting. So once you've kind of done that, can you give me an example of, talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Can you give me kind of like an example that comes to your top of your mind where you think that's kind of worked out well? And how do you translate that, like an example of translating that into like the architecture and interiors?
Oh, yeah. One example right now, current project we have in Garland, Texas, is a building it's a suburb of Dallas, and it's a high population of Hispanic and Vietnamese culture. And that's a place where we did have interpreters help with the engagement process. So we learned what was important to them and their needs within this particular community. And when we began the design of the project, what we did is we did a little bit of an analysis of the two different cultures' vernacular of buildings. And we mapped out the things that would be seen in a Vietnamese structure or a Hispanic structure. And as we mapped those things out, there became evident there were a few commonalities between those two cultures. And one was, in particular, the use of perforated exterior screens to help with heat gain, because both the cultures are in a climate where that would be an important design feature. And incidentally, also in Garland, Texas, it's a similar type of environment. And so we designed the building utilizing this screening that helped with the environmental impacts of solar heat gain, but it was a familiar element that culture was used to. And so it began to draw the two cultures together in the sense that it created a place where they felt comfortable and being and engaging one another in this destination, in this community. So, I think that design, from the very beginning of discussions with stakeholders should be inclusionary to make sure you're thinking about all of the different diverse aspects of a community, and then all the way through to what the actual building elements are. Is it feel like it's a building that meets with those kind of qualities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Stephanie, I guess for you, when you're working on a project and you're thinking about, like we're talking about, like diversity, equity, inclusion, how does that help inform the interiors for you?
It does with the palette, the finishes. Is it something that wants to be more organic, textural? Does it want to have bolder colors? Is this a community that's going to want a vibrant interior, or something more calming? We've done interiors that has, there's populations with like high autism. So, the color palette's very important, and the types of finishes, the layout is important. When you have, English as a first language, you have a lot of tutoring, small study rooms. So kind of laying things out so that, how age groups are going to use the facility, and as well as people that might be adults with tutoring and things like that. So locating and providing, whether it's a lot of glass and transparency or spaces that are a little more private, and helps with the inclusion, and being sensitive to how people are going to use the spaces.
Yeah, the project in Middleburg Heights, Ohio is a good example where there's a population with a population of autistic children. And I think that, as you say, the color, the configuration of the spaces are important. You're picking up on probably the urban ambulance that drives by every so often in downtown. Providing spaces where there can be a comfort or a soothing aspect to area within a building for that type of situation, or whether it's another Cuyahoga County Library, which is in a high African American population. We worked with an author who wrote a story, Let It Shine, Ashley Bryan, who unfortunately passed away. He was in his 90s recently, earlier this year, but he created a book called Let It Shine, and he illustrated the book. And because it was inspired and to speak to the African American population, it was utilizing a lot of vibrant and bold color that was popular in African American art. And so our interiors for this building utilized his illustrations to create space for the children in that community. And it had a really good connection then between, the story of the book, Let It Shine, so kids can come and grow and learn and, explore. And those are the type of things that I think are important connections and design that can be made with a community when you understand what the community is about.
Oh, interesting. Very cool. I want to maybe shift gears just ever so slightly and go back to, when we're talking about like preservation, architectures, interiors of like kind of historic and existing buildings, I'm always running into a lot of examples of like, hey, you've got the Carnegie Library, but we need to add on, whether it's for space, whether it's accessibility. I guess, can you give me an example maybe of a time where, attempts that maybe haven't worked for people? And then we'll switch gears and I want to talk about things that do work.
Yeah. Well, a lot of Carnegie libraries in the 70s and 80s were really I don't want to say destroyed, but the integrity had been taken away in a large degree because at that time, the interest was just to expand to house as much material as you possibly could. And the reference of many to those editions were that they were like book boxes. They were pretty much brutal, just a box with a windowless box that you could put as many 96-inch high shelving units in and have as much collection as you possibly could. And so those were added to many Carnegie libraries, not really keeping or respecting the detailing of the historic building. Mm-hmm. One type of building that is, I think, in our experience, probably the most extreme example of that is for Dowagiac, Michigan, a Carnegie library that had an addition placed right in front of the Carnegie Library, right in front of took the front steps off and put the addition in the front. It was a rectangular box. And to get to the main level of the Carnegie, they put internal stair in, and they put a domed, round, smoked window on top of the stair. It literally looked like a gerbil tube. And when we were hired, the library said, we really want you to think about how we can remove this addition, scrape off that was put on in the 80s, and restore the front of the historic Carnegie Library, and then add we need more space, add an appropriate addition to the back of the building. That's probably one of the more extreme examples we've seen. But there are libraries like Carnegie, the South Branch.
South Branch is a great example because they actually hadn't done really anything to it. They, in the 50s, put some awful lighting in there, but they hadn't destroyed anything, but they never really maintained it either. So it just needed, a good look to get in there and see how we can update it, refresh and maintain those wonderful details that luckily they were able to keep in the plasterwork and, the bookshelves, but then add in those contemporary modern, the library services, power everywhere, getting the updated HVAC and doing it in a way that was complementary and, cohesive. So in the end, the whole project really felt, had a good harmony to the new and the old. And really
interesting. This is talking about new and old. Lots of times we're running, we're working on projects or seeing projects where you're taking like a large existing, maybe Carnegie library or, neoclassical type structure, and you see people putting on kind of more modern structures. We just had Bring Your Kid to Work Day, and we talked about what a Gotti furniture does and what is design. And we had a very intelligent and precocious 8-year-old, and she was grilling me on design. And she said, do people buy the old stuff? And I said, well, sometimes you're balancing out a space and sometimes it has an old. And she's like, well, yeah, you need to have it match. I'm like, yeah, a lot of people like to have it match. But, you're seeing a lot of these kind of like blending of old and new world. How do you guys go through, manage that kind of process of trying to take an old existing building, older aesthetic, and move into, trying to do a more modern addition?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I think that in our work in communities, if we're dealing with a historic building, many communities really have a strong feeling on what you should do or what they should do with their existing building. Some feel that it shouldn't take away from that architecture, that it should match, that it should be seamless. We've done additions to Carnegie's that have been reported in the press at the opening day that says tough to tell old from new. So there was really kind of this appreciation of the original detailing that was implemented in the new building. And then there's others that suggest that, yeah, we'd like to look a little bit forward in our new space. And so how do we take and add on to a historic building, but more in a contemporary way? And when we have those situations, we like to draw the detailing of that contemporary, the more modern piece that gets added onto the building from the details of the old building. So it might be a new material, a contemporary material, but it's kind of arranged in a more traditional way that matches up with maybe part of the historic building. And then there are correlations that can be drawn that suggest that, okay, I see the kind of hierarchy of this design. It's a contemporary design, but it's in the vein of this historic element. So, there's those two facets. There's also the idea that, the Department of Interiors, for kind of additions to historic projects, they like to see what's referred to sometimes as different and distinct, so that there's a real record of, okay, here was the historic part of this building, and I understand that to be what was 1900, and then here's the 2020 version, or addition. And so there's a distinction of that needed. And I think it, like everything else, functionality of what goes into a library, it comes back down to discussions with the community and what that community really would like to see. And there's a lot of different ways that can that can happen.
Interesting.
If I could just add, a lot of times, the contemporary being just very clean, where your historical tends to have a lot more detail to it. It really helps frame it. So you really pick out those
features,
the features, the moldings, dental moldings, the plasterwork. That it's really framed by the more contemporary aspect of the building too.
So, and especially from the interior side, I'm always kind of curious, like, how are you, from the furniture perspective, like for us, how are you trying to balance out? Like, so we did a project with St. Louis Public Library, the main branch, and, they've got modern and traditional. So how do you as an interiors, like balancing out from a furniture perspective, like crossing that modern / traditional line there?
I think a lot of it is in the materials you're using and the way they work together. We've recently done Lakewood Public Library project. We had to rebuild a lot of the perimeter shelving. It has the old details, in the walnut. So the new furniture also has the walnut tying that together, but it has very clean Corian tops to just play up the wood and the old, but bring that detail into the more contemporary pieces, the scale of the pieces as well. We have the slat back chairs because they really wanted that more historical flavor. So we have slat back chairs.
That would speak to your daughter's questioning of you and how some of your products work with older buildings. And that was an Agati chair that was used in the Lakewood Library because there was a walnut chair. It matched with the walnut shelving that was built in on the perimeter. And so we used that chair as the basis of the furnishing piece, but then brought in that contemporary tabletop to kind of blend the two together. And, I think it worked really well. It could be a blend of things.
Yeah, it always seems to be like that. That's the challenge of, how you're kind of trying to balance that out. Yeah, that's interesting process. So as we host these conversations, I'm always kind of curious about, problems and obstacles you guys that overcome. Anything interesting that you've had to, deal with that you can kind of share that would benefit everybody?
Well, problems are things we have to overcome right now after the pandemic, or we're still in the pandemic. Budgets are difficult to deal with. I mean, the cost of labor, the cost of material, the shortage of materials is just really a big problem and challenge that we're kind of maneuvering our way through right now. And, I think that the one good thing is that everybody recognizes what we're dealing with. So, some of those difficult discussions about how to, bring a project into budget and how to maximize the end result out of the costs or the budget that's available has been a real big challenge. But what I'm pleased to know or see is that people are still pressing on. They still know that these are projects that they need to complete for communities because they bring a great value to a community. That libraries are essential to communities. And so, even being still kind of in the pandemic, the next time something flares up again, libraries are that place that can help people through pandemics. So, there is that need to kind of press on. The way we're dealing with it is just we've been getting much more forensic in our development of cost models for projects where we're utilizing multitude of different kind of consultants to kind of estimate projects. You might have a construction manager as one that's got an estimating team that's working on the project. You might have the owner have a third-party estimator that they retain to kind of look at it. And we do our own internal cost estimating. And the reason being is because, particularly with a practice like ours, where we're working all over the country, we need to understand kind of those markets that we're in. And the more information we have that can be dialed into is helpful. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. I mean, otherwise, libraries are ever evolving. And so this isn't necessarily a problem or a challenge, but you have to stay ahead of where you think you might need to be. And one way to do that in library design is just to complete very flexible buildings that can change and adapt to new things that happen as they come about, and whether they're influenced by the pandemic or whether just a new kind of a trend that happens in libraries. For instance, the pandemic has taught all libraries that really didn't think maybe that they needed drive-up services to reconsider that now, because they had for the last couple of years had curbside service because it was predicated by the pandemic. And so now, that's something where, it's almost like a given now. Any new building you're going to design, if you can, into a drive-up services. But otherwise, just completing a very flexible building that will allow the library to continue to evolve as it always has. That's, I wouldn't say a problem. I think it's a challenge because you're thinking about how to set up for the future.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And that's a lot of conversations we have with folks, especially from like a furniture perspective.
Right.
We're always trying to take the long term, and it's difficult when you're trying to say, well, what's it going to be 10 years from now, 15 years from now?
Right.
And lots of times I tell people, like, don't jump on the entire bandwagon with every trend that comes along. Identify it, analyze it, but it's always coming back to like the balance. So yeah, everything. So my concern now is everybody's like flexibility, which is, and I've told it to myself, there's probably, pre-pandemic, there was probably a need for more flexibility. I think people have recognized that coming through kind of the challenge of going through a pandemic and a, global challenge. My one concern is coming out is that, like, I don't want to go back to like the, 2010, 2012 era of like, well, everything's got to be collaborative meeting spaces. And it's like, everybody remembers like everything was a collaborative meeting space. And it's like, well, we're about the people that don't want a meeting. Where do they go?
Right.
So, I'm trying to push people. It's like, it's what are we learning? And then balance that out. Because it's hard. It's hard to try to do that long-term predicting. I think some respects I have it easier for furniture because the building is way more permanent than the furniture. So from a building perspective, it's got to be very, very difficult to think about that long-term approach.
Yeah, well, I think we've all seen not only programmatic space come back around 20 years after maybe it was once done and then changed and now coming popular again. Certainly finishes are also that way. You might have burnt orange color that was once in the 60s now showing up again. But, furnishings, Joe, I mean, you guys have been doing a tremendous job in making these different applications work with, flexible furnishings. I'm not saying on casters, but things that, whether they serve kind of a multitude of things for, and not only in the public library, but even in the academic library where we've been doing some work together. I think those are things that, I think are a challenge in both, whether it's furnishings or the building. You think about it carefully and you'll come up with a good solution.
Yeah, I think some of that evolution is just less built in. So you can have a furnishings and, just being able to rearrange those in a different way. So maybe it is collaborative and they're all collaborative and they're realizing, let's have some inclusion.
Yeah.
If someone wants to come and sit by themselves. So being able to move things around, I think that's a big deal because we used to have those giant desks and now they've gotten smaller. And some of them are actually furniture pieces that could be moved. So you're not ripping things out. And that's part of the sustainability and longevity of it.
Yeah. Do you find that hard, considering you said millwork is what got you into interiors?
Yeah.
And now you're like, it's probably not the best long-term strategy.
Yeah. Being in this industry as long as we have, we've seen the evolution and we've worked with it. We embrace, we want to keep things, evolving too and working for the clients as long as they can. So being a part of those changes, and we've come back to some and reworked. I mean, it's been 15 years, we could see what held up, but it's changed so much that you do a refresh just to make it work better and think ahead. Okay, what have we learned? Let's apply that in moving forward.
Yeah. So Stephanie, how do you Peter mentioned programming. So how are you taking into consideration programming, thinking in the long term? I know you kind of touched a little bit, but maybe you can expand on that a little bit more.
Programming with the building, especially with communities. We just opened the West Perry branch that has a growing community. So you're thinking about long term, it's going to be very different even 5 years from now than it is now as they open up. So programming that would allow spaces to kind of ebb and flow. Maybe you have a large children's area now, but maybe that's going to become a larger teen area down the road, or the adult, so just working in a way that sets up the flow through the building, sets up the service points in key areas, because again, libraries are working with less staff. How do you have oversight, things like that? So really strategically locating things that are easy for a visual organization walking in. The patron knows where they want to go for help, and then sound mitigation. So you have a large children's area. How do you work that in, and how does that work down the road? It is a challenge, but I think utilizing the right materials, floor finishing, for instance, you don't want to have to, if you move the children's grows or shrinks, you don't want to have to replace all the carpeting. So really thinking through how you approach those things so that down the road, if there is a change in the program, you can work with it. You don't have to redesign.
But I've also seen programs themselves become more flexible, and what libraries might have done in a traditional way in a building where they'd set out and say, okay, all my program space is going to be in a meeting room or in a children's activity room. Now that's not the case. We're having pop-up programming happen in every place within the library, including the outdoor space. So I think that when you think about a program, it's probably a good idea to start thinking about it to compartmentalize that this has to happen in here and this has to happen over here, versus I can make this building work for me in anything I want to do in any way, shape, or form. The other project in Indiana that Stephanie mentioned, West Perry, but Clark Pleasant Library for Johnson County, that's exactly what we did. Every space within the library has the ability to do more than one thing, whether it's a seating area that could be for social gathering, or it could be a story time area, or it could be a study area. There's dual purpose that can happen now when you apply some flexibility to a program versus kind of pigeonhole it in all the different, spaces you might have used to know in the past.
Interesting. Do you guys? I know you do you do a lot of public libraries. You do some academic. It seems like the public libraries from a programming side have to be like the bigger challenge to deal with, because am I wrong? Like, it seems like you're like, because every time you're talking about, it's like, well, it's kids, and now it's kids and teens. It's kids, teens, and adults.
Yeah,
and elderly, and it's
absolutely. I mean, a library is a place for everyone, young and old, and different cultures, and all of that. However, I would say that there are the same difficulties and challenges in academics. One thing that's happening that we see both in academic and public library is a need to combine whether it's in the public library realm, co-locate with other civic functions like a rec center or a senior center. Yeah. Well, that same thing is kind of happening in academics. We're working with the University of Nebraska right now in renovation of their main campus library, and they're bringing other student services into the library space. So it's no longer just your traditional academic library. And it's becoming more like a student union or a student learning commons. You've got, a lot of different things happening. So the programming is, I think, as involved in both. I wouldn't necessarily say the public library, just because it's dealing with all age demographic is more difficult. I think the combination of what is being brought into the library, what libraries are becoming more than just a place for books or information.
Yeah, I think that's key. I think library services they keep expanding, and I find that exciting. It's always a new challenge, but providing for those expanded services and the entire community in a public library that's going to use it, as well as academics also are bringing new services into their libraries. And how do you prepare and design for that?
Yeah, interesting. Well, as we're wrapping up here, I always like to put people on the spot a little bit and ask about a past or even current project that maybe is like one of their favorite, or and a lot of people don't like commit to favorites, but maybe most memorable, or maybe we've been talking about kind of trying to preservation, like maybe something that's like what we think is a really good example that stands out.
Oh, okay. Well, I have one actually that is, I think, really appropriate response to that question. So when I first started working with David Holzheimer back in 1999, when it was 4 people, my very first library project was the Sandusky Library. And that it was the first Carnegie Library in Ohio. It was built in 1901. And at that time, it was a big job because we renovated the entire Carnegie. We acquired some property between the next door was a residential piece, but then there was the Erie County Jail that was equally historic. It was built in 1883. The library acquired the jail from the county for $1 because the county went and built a new jail. Really interesting Victorian stone structure. And so our design at that time, back in the early 90s or late 90s, was weaving all of that together. Over the years now, for the last 20 some years, we've been doing little projects for the Sandusky Library, a little reading garden or some other modifications to the children's areas. But today we have a current project where we are now going back through the entire exterior facade of both historic buildings and their adjacent museum space, which was an 1824 era building, and doing a complete historic restoration on the exterior facade. So that is probably a special project for me because, one, it's spanned a couple of decades. Two, it's a original first Carnegie in Ohio, and it's a complicated project. It has a lot of features in it that are pretty interesting. So I would say that's, I think you're right. There's not one that's a favorite because we love libraries and we're proud that everybody in our office has worked on their local library. But that might be one for me, I'd say, has a little bit of interest.
Yeah,
Stephanie, what about you? What would be your most maybe memorable? I don't know, put you on the spot with favorite, but most memorable.
Well, actually, I feel like the Lakewood Library is the most memorable because it has such a dramatic change to it.
Oh, wow.
And I was a very integral part of it. And I got to use my millwork passion, but, just bringing it back to what the quality it was, but then just, seeing the process. I wish I took more pictures before and after because it's just incredible. But then going to the opening and listening and hearing how much that they love and they couldn't believe, because it's a little tiny library, but it's a little jewel within that community. And it just being a part of that and, integral and driving that project was really rewarding. So I think that's going to stay with me a while.
Yeah, it sounds very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wanted to thank you guys for the time today. I think this was very educational, and I think people are really going to enjoy it.
Good. Well, thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.